We know that widowed or divorced men can be sealed to more than one woman in Latter-day Saint temples, but this video is about something different. Are women anointed in the temple to be eternal plural wives? As they promise to obey a law of chastity, are they allowing for their husbands to have other wives? We have been taught that the temple is sacred and whatever happens there should not be discussed. I would prefer to follow that guidance, but I believe God would want us to be aware of the truth surrounding this mistaken plural marriage belief wherever we find it, even in our temples today. In 2019, I was looking forward to attending the temple endowment session. I'd heard about changes made to the ceremony, and I read that women were feeling less marginalized. I came expecting the best, but near the beginning of the session, I was delivered the worst. This January 2019 Salt Lake Tribune article by Jana Reese discussed the changes I was expecting. The article said in the temple, women were no longer hearkening to their husbands, but directly to God. Eve was more prominent. Men and women covenant together rather than separately. There was gender equality in the sealing ceremony, with men and women making the same promises to each other. This article also pointed out that there was no longer the struggle for women to hear they would be queens and priestesses unto their husbands, while those husbands would be kings and priests directly to God. It was true. As I sat in the temple in 2019, I didn't hear women would be queens and priestesses unto their husbands. Of course, I also didn't hear that women would be queens and priestesses unto God. Instead, I heard that women were anointed to be queens and priestesses in the new and everlasting covenant. What? I had studied Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, enough to recognize that phrase. While most women thought not being anointed to their husband was a step up, I believed being anointed in the new and everlasting covenant was far more troubling. I knew that the new and everlasting covenant, that exact combination of words, is only used in two sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, in sections 131 and 132. It's not used together in exactly that way in any other scripture. A search of the word covenant in the Old and New Testament, and also the Book of Mormon, shows the word covenant is never used in connection with marriage. Only in sections 131 and 132, that both have questionable beginnings, does it refer to marriage. In section 131, verse 2, the new and everlasting covenant of marriage wording, in parentheses, was mysteriously added in 1876. 32 years after Joseph's death, and at the same time, Section 132 was placed in the Doctrine and Covenants. This allowed both sections to agree on the meaning of this phrase. 131 says that to obtain the highest degree of the celestial glory, we must enter the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. So as I sat in the temple in 2019, I knew that D&C 132 is about many wives and concubines, and that somehow the new and everlasting covenant of marriage was connected to many wives' marriages, with some concubines thrown in, I guess. I knew that reading section 132 as a woman had never been a pleasant experience. In fact, it was degrading. In 132, women are given as property, told they must embrace adultery-type behavior from their husbands, and if they don't, they'll be destroyed. I knew all these things, so being anointed under the new and everlasting covenant was, to use an overused phrase, triggering. I vowed I was not going back to the temple. I felt deceived. When I was baptized at age 17, the church's plural marriage doctrine wasn't disclosed to me. It wasn't part of the missionary discussions, and I wouldn't learn of this troubling teaching until years later. Here I was in 2019 as a 65-year-old woman sitting in the temple, and my eternal role as a plural wife was again being concealed, or at best disguised. In fact, it was disguised enough that even Jana Rees, a brilliant journalist, author, and feminist whose writing I admire, had not mentioned this in her Salt Lake Tribune article. She extolled the 2019 temple improvements for women. Of course, maybe plural marriage didn't bother her. But I doubt she would have thought that men being anointed to the Most High God to rule and reign forever, while women were anointed to polygamy, was equality. Then again, this new and everlasting covenant phrase was well disguised, and she probably hadn't spent the last 30 years like I had trying to make sense of Section 132 and its plural marriage demands. A few years later, I found a blog that did not miss the significance of these 2019 temple changes. It's linked in the description notes. Now, this may not be the only place this issue was explained, but it was the website I found, and it rang true with me. This blogger, Michael Matthews, succinctly went through these 2019 changes and Section 132. He provides more details than I will in this video. First, here's the header that tells us that Section 132 is about the new and everlasting covenant. Then Michael says the first two verses of Section 132 are the most telling and the most overlooked. D&C 132 is a direct response to a direct inquiry. Joseph allegedly asked God specifically about many wives and concubines. Then, notice the dash with the yellow arrow. Verse 1 is a reference to a specific question. Everything after the dash is a direct answer to that question. Verse 2 finishes the sentence by saying, "Will answer thee as touching this matter." This matter is specifically many wives and concubines. Section 132 is not about monogamous marriage because all of 132 is answering that specific inquiry about polygamy. Verse 4 is the first place the doctrine identifies the name of the law that is supposedly being revealed in answer to the question about having many wives and concubines. This is how it is justified. Joseph allegedly inquires how many wives and concubines are justified, and the answer is provided. It is justified by the new and everlasting covenant. The new and everlasting covenant is polygamy. So in other words, at the beginning of Section 132, the question is asked, how do we justify many wives and concubines, or polygamy? The answer is given, we justify polygamy through the new and everlasting covenant. Where do we find the details of this justification? In D&C 132, we find the grounds for polygamy through the new and everlasting covenant. What are the results? Women are anointed in the new and everlasting covenant in the temple. As an example of 132 detailing how to justify polygamy, Michael Matthews reminds us that in verse 1, Joseph Smith was allegedly inquiring about many wives and concubines, and that verse specifically mentions Abraham. In what context are we speaking about Abraham? Many wives and concubines. Verse 32 says, "Go ye therefore and do the works of Abraham." What are the works of Abraham? Many wives and concubines. As an aside, God did not command multiple wives in the Old Testament. Humans who were flawed like all of us encouraged this lifestyle. In this case, Abraham, who was then called Abram, followed the desires of his wife Sarah, who was then called Sarai. Sarai wasn't able to have a child and was losing faith that God would fulfill his promise and give her a child, so she used her maidservant Hagar, which was the custom of their times. We are taught the temple is our ultimate destination in this life. I find it troubling that this ultimate destination comes with this polygamy baggage from sections 131 and 132. From these sections, we're told the new and everlasting covenant is a requirement for heaven, and that requirement is to be polygamous. Going back to my 2019 temple experience, while phrasing towards the end of that endowment session sounded strange to me, I was reeling from the new and everlasting covenant reference, so I overlooked the unfamiliar wording in the law of chastity covenant. Formerly clear language was now ambiguous. The previous wording referred to a single husband and a single wife. The 2019 version uses the plural word those in this covenant. In another post, Michael mentions that those displays built-in plurality. A man with one wife or a man with 10 wives can meet the requirement of those. Michael also points out that the previous law of chastity wording in the temple said legally and lawfully wedded, but now adds according to his law on the end. So rather than governments, which for the most part make polygamy illegal, the God who supposedly dictated Section 132 determines what is legal and lawful. Polygamy is not only legal and lawful under his laws, but this God of Section 132 demands all his children be polygamists in order to return to him. Another thought, though, gay marriage was made legal in 2015, so maybe that was the reason for referring to God's law rather than government laws. But I find it interesting that this change happened at the same time wording was added to anoint women in the new and everlasting covenant, and the chastity covenant wording was changed to allow for plural wives. Perhaps switching from government laws that mostly outlaw polygamy to a God whose laws demand polygamy would tie up any loose ends. I don't know. 5 years after my 2019 temple experience, visitors from Panama came to see me in 2024. Almost 50 years ago, I had taught 2 women and watched them get baptized when I was a missionary in Central America. They traveled from Panama with family members. The temple was at the top of their list of things to do, yet I had resolved 5 years ago that I wasn't going back. After some agonizing, I decided to go with them to the temple rather than try to explain in my lousy Spanish all my concerns. Besides, I couldn't face disappointing them. I love these people. My 2024 temple experience was meaningful because of the people I was with. At the same time, I observed that all the problem polygamy areas were still there. To make it even clearer, this time I not only heard the words, but read them as captions on a large screen. I recently enjoyed reading a book that was published in 1874. Fanny Stenhouse was an Englishwoman who told of being Mormon, hearing rumors of the plural marriage teaching, and making her way to Utah with her husband and family. Eventually, her prominent husband was convinced to take another wife. Fanny, of course, was not consulted. Fanny's situation wasn't unique. Many women joined the church or came out west, only to learn later that they would become plural wives. This inevitable fate was not disclosed to them until they were left with little or no choice. My 2019 and 2024 temple experiences felt like a similar deception. Were women being hoodwinked again? So why does it matter whether polygamy is in the temple, and why should we be told if it is? In my first video, I suggest that plural marriage doctrine is taking God's name in vain, which in God's eyes is the most serious sin. My second video covered how data proves the lifestyle is inherently harmful and that the belief in eternal plural marriage is also harmful. My third video touched on how this teaching affects relationships, intimacy, and sin. Specifically, how this plural marriage teaching violates God's commandment for men and violates the desires God has given women. This one-sided law hurts those who most need the protection. It also deadens our God-given conscience. So plural marriage in the temple matters to me because I obviously believe it goes contrary to God's teaching as outlined in scriptures. One of the positive changes I noticed in my last temple visit is that the covenants that will be made during the session are summarized towards the beginning of the session. Temple patrons have an idea of what they'll be agreeing to. Most church members who enter the temple believe God endorses everything that happens there. Shouldn't they be informed that according to their beliefs, they are accepting and agreeing to plural marriage in this life or the eternities? I no longer believe that God is a polygamist, nor that my fate or the fate of any woman is to be an eternal plural wife, even if that's what's said in the temple. But if the temple points to polygamy, shouldn't that be disclosed to me also? I got this image from the church's website a few years ago, and to me it illustrates the prominence we give the temple. For these 2019 changes in this prominent place, I'd like to think there's an explanation other than polygamy, but I don't think so. I understand that this is part of the historical church beliefs, but is it fair that from my convert baptism as a teenager to my temple attendance as an adult, it feels as if there's been a deliberate effort to keep me and others in the dark about this crucial part of our doctrine? Some women won't be troubled and won't care that they're signing up for polygamy. But others might see this the way I did, like a cockroach in an ice cream sundae. Either way, I think honesty and full disclosure in the temple would be a good policy. Of course, in my opinion, the best policy would be to remove polygamy from the temple, rescind Section 132, and repent of the many wives doctrine.